Attention! Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in Georgia history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1856, the city of Savannah, Georgia, witnessed what would become one of the most disturbing mysteries in its antebellum history. The case of Peter Lewis, a 23-year-old enslaved man who worked the rice plantations along the Savannah River, defied every attempt at explanation by both authorities and the community that knew him. What began as a routine disappearance evolved into a web of silence, fear, and questions that would haunt Chatham County for decades to come. Peter Lewis belonged to the Whitmore plantation, a sprawling estate located 15 miles southeast of Savannah's historic district, where the Ogeechee River bends toward the Atlantic coast. The property, established in 1742 by Charleston merchant Thomas Whitmore, had passed to his son Edmund by the time Peter arrived as part of an estate settlement in 1849. The younger Whitmore, known for his methodical record-keeping and stern, but not unusually harsh treatment of his workforce, maintained detailed logs of every person, animal, and tool on his property. According to plantation records discovered in 1962 during the renovation of the old Chatham County Courthouse, Peter Lewis stood out among the 47 enslaved individuals at Whitmore Plantation. Born in South Carolina and sold to the Whitmores at age 16, Peter possessed an unusual ability to read and write, skills that Edmund Whitmore had grudgingly allowed him to develop after discovering the young man teaching himself using discarded newspapers. This literacy made Peter valuable as a record keeper for rice harvests and livestock counts, but it also set him apart from others in ways that would later prove significant. The plantation's location along a bend in the Ogeechee River provided natural isolation that Edmund Whitmore had cultivated deliberately. Dense stands of live oak draped with Spanish moss created a canopy so thick that even midday sun barely penetrated to the ground level. The main house, built of tabby concrete mixed with oyster shells, sat on a rise overlooking rice fields that stretched toward the marsh. Behind the house, a network of outbuildings included quarters for the enslaved workforce, storage barns, and a small building that Whitmore used as his private office. Life at the plantation followed rigid patterns that had remained unchanged for years. Work began before dawn, with the ringing of a brass bell that could be heard across the entire property. Peter's responsibilities included maintaining inventory records and assisting with correspondence, which meant he spent considerable time in or near the main house. Other enslaved individuals later described him as quiet and thoughtful, someone who kept to himself, but helped others when needed. He had no known family connections on the plantation and rarely spoke about his life before arriving at Whitmore. The first indication that something was amiss came on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1856. When the brass bell rang at its usual time, Peter Lewis did not appear for his morning duties. Edmund Whitmore, accustomed to Peter's punctuality, initially assumed the young man was ill and sent another worker to check the quarters. What they found was Peter's sleeping area undisturbed, his few possessions exactly as they had been left the previous evening, and no sign of where he might have gone. A search of the immediate plantation grounds revealed nothing unusual. Peter's work materials remained in Whitmore's office, including ledger books he had been updating the previous afternoon. The plantation's dogs, typically quick to alert to any unusual activity, had been quiet throughout the night. Most puzzling was the absence of any obvious route of escape. The plantation's location meant that anyone leaving on foot would need to cross either the river or navigate through miles of marsh and swampland to reach the nearest road. Edmund Whitmore's initial response followed standard procedure for such situations. He notified the county sheriff and posted notices in Savannah offering a reward for Peter's return. These notices, preserved in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, describe Peter as being of medium height and build, with distinctive scars on his left hand from a childhood accident. The reward amount, $25, was modest compared to Peter's estimated value of $400, suggesting Whitmore expected a quick resolution. The sheriff's investigation, conducted by Deputy Marshal James Crawford, uncovered the first troubling inconsistencies. Crawford interviewed every person on the plantation, both enslaved and free, and found that no one claimed to have seen or heard anything unusual on the night of Peter's disappearance. This unanimous silence struck Crawford as implausible. Given the close quarters and interconnected nature of plantation life, his report, filed with the county clerk, noted that while everyone cooperated with questioning, their responses seemed rehearsed and careful in a manner that suggests prior discussion. More disturbing was Crawford's discovery that Peter had been seen in Whitmore's private office unusually late on the evening before his disappearance. Sarah Mitchell, an enslaved woman who worked in the main house, mentioned this detail almost accidentally during questioning. When pressed for specifics, she claimed uncertainty about the exact time, but estimated it had been well after the usual end of the workday. Edmund Whitmore, when asked about this, confirmed that Peter had been updating harvest records, but insisted nothing unusual had occurred. As September turned to October, the search for Peter Lewis expanded beyond the plantation grounds. Crawford organized searches of the surrounding countryside, focusing on known routes that escaping enslaved people had used in the past. These efforts involved local plantation owners and their workers, creating a network of eyes and ears across Chatham County. Despite covering hundreds of square miles of woods, swamps, and waterways, the searches yielded no trace of Peter or any indication of the direction he might have taken. The absence of any evidence began to generate speculation within Savannah's small but interconnected community. Some suggested that Peter had received assistance from abolitionists known to operate along the Georgia coast. Others theorized that he had hidden somewhere on the plantation property itself, waiting for an opportunity to make his escape. A few whispered darker possibilities, noting that the river and surrounding marshland had claimed many lives over the years and could easily conceal a body. Edmund Whitmore's behavior during this period struck some observers as unusual, though not necessarily suspicious. According to accounts preserved in letters between plantation owners, Whitmore seemed less concerned about the financial loss than about the implications for discipline among his remaining workforce. He increased security measures, restricted movement after dark, and implemented new procedures for accounting for every person on the property. These changes suggested that he feared Peter's disappearance might encourage similar attempts by others. The investigation took an unexpected turn in early November when workers cleaning out a storage building discovered a leather satchel hidden beneath loose floorboards. The satchel contained papers that appeared to be in Peter's handwriting, though the content was initially difficult to decipher. Deputy Crawford confiscated these materials and spent several days attempting to understand their significance. What he found would complicate the case considerably. The papers included what appeared to be copies of correspondence between Edmund Whitmore and various business associates. Some letters dealt with routine plantation matters, but others contained references to financial arrangements and transactions that Crawford found confusing. More troubling were several pages that seemed to document meetings or conversations, written in a style that suggested Peter had been taking notes or creating records of events he had witnessed. The handwriting analysis, conducted by a clerk at the Savannah courthouse, confirmed that Peter had written these documents. When confronted with these findings, Edmund Whitmore's demeanor changed noticeably. He acknowledged that Peter had access to his correspondence as part of his clerical duties, but denied knowledge of any unauthorized copying. He suggested that Peter might have been practicing his writing skills or creating personal notes for reasons Whitmore could not fathom. This explanation satisfied some observers, but raised new questions about the extent of Peter's activities and his possible motivations for disappearing. The discovery of the papers coincided with the arrival in Savannah of Marcus Whitmore, Edmund's older brother who lived in Charleston and held partial ownership of the plantation. Marcus had come to assess the situation and determine whether additional security measures were needed. His presence brought a different perspective to the investigation, as he questioned assumptions that had guided the search efforts up to that point. Marcus Whitmore suggested that Peter's disappearance might not have been an escape attempt at all. He pointed out that Peter's valuable skills and relatively comfortable position made him an unlikely candidate for flight, especially given the enormous risks involved. Instead, Marcus proposed that something specific had prompted Peter's departure, something connected to the papers found in the storage building. This theory shifted the focus from finding an escaped slave to uncovering what Peter might have learned or witnessed. The investigation's new direction led Deputy Crawford to examine Edmund Whitmore's business activities more closely. Plantation records revealed a complex network of relationships with merchants, shippers, and other plantation owners throughout the region. Some of these relationships involved transactions that went beyond the typical buying and selling of crops and supplies. Crawford discovered references to arrangements that seemed designed to move money and goods in ways that avoided normal documentation and oversight. Among the papers Peter had copied were portions of correspondence discussing the movement of people between properties, arrangements that did not align with standard slave trading practices. These documents suggested a level of coordination between plantation owners that extended beyond normal business relationships. While Crawford could not determine whether anything illegal was occurring, the secretive nature of these arrangements provided a possible explanation for Peter's fate. The breakthrough in understanding came from an unexpected source. In late November, a letter arrived at the courthouse addressed to Deputy Crawford. The letter, postmarked from Jacksonville, Florida, contained no signature but included information that only someone familiar with the case could have known. The anonymous correspondent claimed that Peter Lewis was alive, but could never return to Georgia. The letter provided specific details about the contents of the hidden satchel, and suggested that Crawford should examine Edmund Whitmore's financial records more carefully. The letter's most significant revelation concerned a network of individuals involved in moving both money and people through a series of plantations and shipping operations. According to the anonymous source, Peter had discovered evidence of this network and had been documenting its activities for several months before his disappearance. The letter implied that Peter's copying of correspondence was not random but targeted, focusing on communications that revealed the scope and nature of these operations. Armed with this information, Crawford returned to Whitmore Plantation with a team of county officials to conduct a more thorough search. This time, they focused on areas that had not been examined previously, including outbuildings and sections of the property that Edmund Whitmore had claimed were too damaged or dangerous to access. In a partially collapsed building that had once served as a blacksmith shop, they made a discovery that changed the entire character of the investigation. Beneath the debris and accumulated earth of years, the search team uncovered a space that had been deliberately concealed. The area contained evidence of recent use, including items that suggested someone had been held there against their will. More significantly, they found additional papers in Peter's handwriting, including what appeared to be a detailed account of events leading up to his disappearance. These documents provided the first direct evidence of what had actually happened to Peter Lewis. According to the papers found in the concealed space, Peter had indeed discovered information about illegal activities involving several plantation owners, including his own. The network he had documented was involved in smuggling operations that used enslaved people as both labor and cover for moving contraband goods through the coastal waterways. Peter's position as a literate record-keeper had given him access to correspondence that revealed the full extent of these operations. The documents indicated that Peter had initially planned to use his information to bargain for his freedom, believing that the value of his silence would outweigh his value as property. However, his approach to Edmund Whitmore had resulted in a very different outcome. Rather than negotiating, Whitmore had chosen to eliminate the threat Peter represented. The papers suggested that Peter had been confined to the concealed space while Whitmore and others decided how to handle the situation. The final entries in Peter's account, dated just days before his disappearance, revealed a plan to escape that went beyond simply fleeing the plantation. Peter had managed to get word to contacts in Savannah who could help him reach safety, but he had also arranged for copies of his documentation to be sent to authorities if he failed to make contact by a specified date. This explanation accounted for the anonymous letter that had directed Crawford's investigation toward the truth. What remained unclear was Peter's ultimate fate. The concealed space showed signs of having been abandoned hastily, and despite extensive searches, no trace of Peter himself was ever found. The anonymous letter had claimed he reached safety in Florida, but no verification of this claim ever emerged. Some investigators theorized that Peter had been killed and his body disposed of in the river or marshland, while others believed he had successfully escaped but chose to remain silent to protect himself and others. The investigation's findings had immediate consequences for Edmund Whitmore and several other plantation owners implicated in the smuggling network. However, the political and social climate of 1856 Georgia limited how far authorities were willing to pursue charges that might destabilize the region's economic foundations. Edmund Whitmore faced questioning and scrutiny, but was never formally charged with any crime. The official records describe the case as an investigation into the disappearance of escaped property, with no mention of the broader implications uncovered during the search. By the spring of 1857, the case of Peter Lewis had been quietly closed. Edmund Whitmore sold his plantation and moved to Alabama, citing concerns about security and the reliability of his workforce. Several other plantation owners involved in the network made similar decisions, effectively dissolving the operations that Peter had documented. The official explanation for these departures focused on economic factors and family considerations, avoiding any reference to criminal activity. The papers documenting Peter's discoveries and the evidence of the smuggling network were placed in the county archives, where they remained largely forgotten until their rediscovery during courthouse renovations in 1962. By that time, the individuals involved were long dead, and the specific operations they had conducted were historical curiosities rather than active criminal matters. However, the documents provided valuable insight into the hidden complexities of antebellum Georgia's economic and social systems. Local memory of the Peter Lewis case persisted in Chatham County through oral traditions that emphasized different aspects of the story depending on who was telling it. Among the African American community, Peter became a symbol of resistance and intelligence, someone who had used his literacy and position to fight back against the system that enslaved him. White residents tended to remember the case as an example of the dangers posed by educated slaves and the importance of maintaining strict control over information and movement. The Whitmore plantation itself remained abandoned for several years after Edmund's departure. Local residents reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena around the property, leading to speculation that the place was haunted by Peter's spirit. These stories, while reflecting the supernatural beliefs common in rural Georgia, also served as a way for the community to process the unresolved questions surrounding the case. The plantation buildings gradually deteriorated, and the land was eventually sold and divided among smaller farmers. In 1864, during the final years of the Civil War, Union troops occupied the former Whitmore plantation as part of their operations along the Georgia coast. Soldiers searching the property for supplies or intelligence discovered additional evidence related to Peter's case, including documents that had been missed during the original investigation. These findings confirmed many of the details in Peter's account and provided new information about the scope of the smuggling network he had exposed. The war's end brought freedom to the enslaved population of Chatham County, but it also meant that many questions about Peter Lewis's fate would never be answered. Former slaves who had known Peter were reluctant to discuss the case openly, partly from fear of retribution and partly from uncertainty about what had really happened. Those who did speak often provided contradictory accounts that reflected the confusion and trauma of the period. As Georgia entered the Reconstruction era, the story of Peter Lewis took on new significance as an example of the hidden resistance that had existed within the slave system. Historians and journalists investigating antebellum Georgia began to recognize the case as evidence of the complex networks of information and support that enslaved people had created, despite the restrictions placed on their movement and communication. Peter's use of literacy as a tool of resistance became a powerful symbol for educational advocates working to establish schools for freed slaves. The anonymous letter that had provided crucial information to Deputy Crawford remained a mystery that added to the case's enduring fascination. Speculation about its author included theories that Peter himself had written it after reaching safety, that someone who had helped him escape was providing updates on his welfare, or that a member of the smuggling network was attempting to divert attention from other aspects of their operations. The truth about the letter's origin was never established. Modern historians examining the Peter Lewis case have noted its significance as documentation of the sophisticated economic networks that operated outside legal channels in the antebellum South. The smuggling operations Peter documented represented just one example of how plantation owners and other economic elites circumvented regulations and restrictions that might limit their profits. Peter's position as a literate slave with access to correspondence gave him unique insight into these operations, but it also made him exceptionally vulnerable when his knowledge became a threat. The case also highlighted the precarious position of enslaved people who possessed valuable skills or knowledge. While literacy and specialized abilities could provide certain advantages within the slave system, they also created risks that less skilled individuals did not face. Peter's intelligence and education made him valuable to Edmund Whitmore, but they also made him dangerous when he chose to use those abilities to resist rather than simply serve. Archaeological investigations of the former Whitmore plantation site, conducted by the University of Georgia in the 1950s and 60s, uncovered additional evidence related to Peter's case. Excavations revealed the location of the concealed space where Peter had been held, along with artifacts that confirmed the use of the site for clandestine activities. These findings provided physical verification of the accounts contained in Peter's papers and helped establish the credibility of his documentation. The broader historical context of Peter Lewis's story reflects the tensions and contradictions that characterized Georgia's antebellum society. The state's economy depended heavily on slave labor, but that same system created educated and capable individuals who could challenge its foundations when given the opportunity. Peter's case demonstrated how individual acts of resistance could expose larger networks of exploitation and illegality, even when those acts ultimately failed to achieve their immediate goals. Contemporary accounts of the case, preserved in newspaper archives and private correspondence, reveal the anxiety that Peter's disappearance generated among plantation owners throughout the region. The possibility that an enslaved person could gather detailed intelligence about illegal operations and potentially use that information to harm their owner's interests represented a nightmare scenario for those who benefited from the existing system. The swift abandonment of the smuggling network after Peter's exposure showed how vulnerable these operations were to discovery. The legacy of the Peter Lewis case extended beyond its immediate historical significance to influence discussions about resistance, intelligence, and agency within enslaved communities. Modern scholars have used the documentation Peter created as evidence that enslaved people possessed far more knowledge about their owners' affairs than was generally acknowledged at the time. This awareness allowed some individuals to identify opportunities for resistance or escape that might not have been apparent to those without access to such information. The question of Peter's ultimate fate remained a subject of speculation and investigation for decades after the original case was closed. In 1947, a researcher examining 19th-century records in Jacksonville, Florida, discovered documents that might have been related to Peter's case. These papers, found in the archives of a church that had assisted escaped slaves, included references to a man matching Peter's description who had arrived in the area in late 1856. However, the documentation was incomplete and could not definitively establish a connection to the Georgia case. Similar potential sightings and references surfaced periodically in historical research, creating a trail of possible evidence that Peter had indeed survived and reached safety. However, none of these findings provided conclusive proof, and the question of his fate remained unresolved. For many who studied the case, this uncertainty added to its power as a symbol of resistance and hope, suggesting that Peter might have achieved the freedom he sought, despite the overwhelming obstacles he faced. The physical remnants of the Whitmore plantation continued to deteriorate throughout the 20th century, but the site retained significance for local historians and genealogists researching the antebellum period. Efforts to preserve and interpret the location have been complicated by the complex and troubling nature of its history, which includes both the exploitation of enslaved labor and the resistance that Peter Lewis represents. These competing narratives reflect the broader challenges of commemorating and understanding the legacy of slavery in American history. In recent decades, the Peter Lewis case has gained renewed attention from historians interested in the agency and resistance of enslaved people. The detailed documentation he created provides rare insight into the perspective and intelligence of someone who experienced slavery firsthand but refused to accept it passively. His use of literacy and his position within the plantation hierarchy to gather and preserve evidence of illegal activity represents a form of resistance that was both sophisticated and dangerous. The case also serves as a reminder of the countless other instances of resistance and intelligence that may have occurred but left no documentary trace. Peter's story survived because he was literate and because circumstances led to the preservation of his writings, but many others who displayed similar courage and intelligence may have vanished without leaving any record of their efforts. This realization has prompted historians to look more carefully at traditional sources and to seek new ways of uncovering the hidden experiences of enslaved communities. The moral complexity of Peter Lewis's story continues to generate discussion among those who study it. His decision to document illegal activity and attempt to use that information to secure his freedom raises questions about the choices available to enslaved people and the risks they were willing to accept in pursuit of liberty. The fact that his efforts may have succeeded, despite the immediate danger he faced, provides a different perspective on the possibilities for resistance within even the most restrictive circumstances. As the story of Peter Lewis recedes further into history, its significance as a documented example of intelligence, resistance, and courage within the slave system has only grown. The papers he left behind provide a voice from the past that speaks directly to the experience of slavery in ways that official records and plantation documents cannot match. His words carry the weight of personal experience and the urgency of someone fighting for his life and freedom. The questions that Peter Lewis's case raises about justice, resistance, and survival remain relevant long after the specific circumstances that created them have passed into history. His story serves as a reminder that even within systems designed to deny human dignity and agency, individuals could find ways to assert their intelligence, gather information, and fight back against their oppressors. Whether or not Peter ultimately achieved the freedom he sought, his efforts to document and resist the system that enslaved him represent a victory of human spirit over institutional cruelty. And perhaps, in the end, the mystery surrounding Peter Lewis's fate is less important than the certainty of his courage. In a world that sought to reduce him to property, he insisted on being recognized as a person with intelligence, agency, and the right to freedom. His voice, preserved in the papers he risked his life to create, continues to speak across the centuries, reminding us that the human desire for liberty cannot be permanently silenced, no matter how severe the consequences for expressing it might be.